My name is Brian Griffin. Welcome to another in a series of oral histories that I've been doing of significant people of our community for some time now. All of these oral histories can be viewed and in fact borrowed at the Bellingham Public Library and viewed at the Watkin Museum Photo Archives or the Center for Northwest Studies at Western Washington University. Once someone said to me, "When an old man dies, it's like a library burning." Well, I've never forgotten that, and that has prompted me to do this series of oral histories. I think it's important to record the life stories of people of our time for future generations. Well, here I am on a beautiful sunny January day talking to Joyce Morse, who must first be congratulated for her 95th birthday the other day.
Yes.
Good heavens, that's wonderful. You even got your family put a nice thing in the newspaper.
Yes, and Pat and Aaron put me in the newspaper and I could have choked them.
Ha!
I don't like that.
Well, it was fun
And the whole, I gave all those pictures away, and Pat had stashed them away and hauled them out for Aaron. So
it was fun to see the picture of you as a senior in high school.
well, actually, I think that picture that they put in was when I graduated from college, but I think they goofed a little.
Well, we're here to talk about your life. So, I usually ask people if they remember their grandparents.
I do remember my grandparents.
Good. Tell me.
My mother came from Waterville, Washington. My mother came from Eastern Washington, where I was born, and she emigrated from Oregon with her parents when she was a baby in a covered wagon from Oregon to Waterville. And it's because they could I think they called it, they could prove their land by moving on it, living on it, and farming it. So my grandfather built a house and they lived in it. My grandmother had a lot of interesting stories.
In Waterville, which is north of Wenatchee, up in the high wheat country.
Up on the hill, beautiful wheat farming country.
So you're
beautiful country.
It is. Your grandfather was a wheat farmer.
Right. And they planted their farm and proved it. And my grandmother, he died, and so I really don't remember him, but my grandmother told me that they moved out on their farm and Indians had owned all this territory. And she said the white men ruined the Indians. They could give them whiskey and Indians would give them anything. So she said she lived out in the country on this farm, and when she and her two little girls would see Indians walking down the road, they knew they were probably drunk and that they would come to the door. So my grandmother would take the two little girls out, and the wheat was very tall in those days, unlike the wheat they grow now. And they could lie down in a wheat field and be invisible. So they would do that. And then she told me a story about one day when she looked out and she saw drunken Indians walking down the road, and they were really close to the house. So she couldn't take the girls out, and she stood at the door, and when they came to the door and banged on it. She said, she was a mild little soul, but she said, if you come through that door, I've got this shotgun and I'll shoot a hole through you that you could throw a cat through.
Huh. Huh.
And she meant it, and I think they knew it, and so they left her alone. But my grandfather, of course, was out working someplace and didn't know this.
So what year might that have been? In the
80 something, I think.
Probably.
I think 1880 something.
So they came from Oregon. I'll bet before that, they probably came across to Oregon from the east on a wagon train.
Well, no, her grandfather had come west, and he was a doctor and practiced in Esquio, S-C-I-O, Oregon.
S-E...
Pat said she knows where that is. I've never seen it. She lived in Oregon, and she said she remembered seeing that name.
What was their name?
Richardson.
So maybe your great-grandfather came across in the 1840s on
Yes.
the wagon train.
Yes. Then they had a big family, so of course there were too many for the farm they had. So my grandfather, by that time, had married Melissa Richard. He was Turner. She was Richardson, and they left there because there wasn't enough for the family, and took his family in a covered wagon to Waterville. Made their way across, and then my grandmother had one more little girl who was just a little bit younger than my mother. And then a long time later, she had one more little girl. So there were 3 girls in that family. And my grandfather needed a boy to work on his farm. So when a neighbor family, when the parents died, Grandma said that the custom was that neighbors would take the children, divide up the family, and take a child. And they took a boy because my grandfather thought he would help, and I think they thought he was a little hard on this boy, so that he ran away as soon as he was old enough to join the Navy. And I think they saw him a few times. I never met him or had him.
So your grandfather in Waterville and grandmother, now their name was Turner.
Then my grandfather liked brick houses, so he built a brick house first on the farm, and then he built a house in Waterville, the brick house, which my grandmother lived in. We used to go there, and we loved to go there. David and I stopped with her in that house on our honeymoon. We'd run out of money, so we stayed with her for the rest of our time. And Grandma was wonderful. She was a wonderful cook and hospitable. So we all thought the world of her. And she lived there. My grandfather died young, and I don't know what happened to him, but there was not much medical help for him. Then Grandma lived there all the rest of her life.
So was and is the house, the brick house, in the town of Waterville?
It's still there, and I think it's been remodeled and maybe a little added on to. But of course I haven't seen that, but I loved going there, and my grandmother's bedroom was upstairs, and and she would sit, she had a rocking chair that she sat in to write her letters. And they weren't spelled very well because she hadn't had any schooling.
At all?
But she could write, she could tell us what she wanted to do. And after she died, before she died, she said, when Bob was born, she said, now, I want Bob to have this chair when I'm gone. So I took it and kept it until Bob married Jeanette, and then I gave them the chair, which they still have.
How nice.
Jeanette can sit in it.
How nice. Well, now, a lot of the wheat farmers lived out in the countryside where they had their farm and usually a farmhouse, and then when they retired, they moved into Waterville or Wenatchee and lived in the city.
They lived in both houses, I think, before the end. I don't know what.
So they did have a house out on the farmland.
Yes, a brick house, because my grandfather wanted brick houses.
So he had two brick houses, one in the
Yes.
city and one on the
Yes.
farm.
I never saw the one on the farm, but the one in town is still there, and my children, Bob and Jeanette, drove through Waterville, I think a year ago, that Bob is building that a steel building over in Moses Lake. So he can go through Waterville to go there, and likes to do that. And when they were there the last time, he was telling me about some of the interesting things about the town. I haven't been there for a while. I'm not ever going back. But he said that they talked to people in the restaurant where they ate, and they remembered, especially some of the aunt's family. So, and I think there's still some descendants of theirs living there. In fact, I know there are.
Some descendants of
My grandmothers, the Turners. And of course their names, I don't know. I used to be in touch with one of the sons, and he was doing some genealogy, and he started corresponding with me, and I got tired of being the one who kept all the records. I didn't like it. I after David wasn't well, I didn't have time to do that stuff, so I gave up. But I had a niece on my father's side who was a genealogy nut. Her house was full of genealogy stuff, and when she got into computers, she had a computer full of it, and used to write to me on the computer try to keep her up to date. And again, I got tired of doing that, and I gave all the stuff to Pat and said, you keep it and do whatever you want to with it. So she's got it.
Good. She's the holder of the records, huh?
Yeah.
So your mother, a Turner, eventually married someone. What was that story? Who did she?
My mother was married young to a man named Thomas Weir, and he died, I think, before her second baby was born, or maybe right after her second baby was born. He had appendicitis, and that was it.
Boy, people died of all kinds of things that today are hardly a threat at all.
Yes, there was no help for it. And so here was my mother with two babies, and her husband's, who had died, his sister came and helped for a while, and one of my sisters remembers her. I never met her. But That's the way it was.
Was she still living in Waterville?
She was at that time.
Excuse me?
She was at that time,
Oh,
yeah. The only relatives still in Waterville now are cousins. And one cousin's son is farming, I think, all of these farms, which have been very profitable with the subsidies that have been in place.
so all of your grandfather's farm and all of those family farms are still in?
Yes, Gail and I owned my father's together, and we knew there wasn't enough for our children to divide, and so at that time we needed money for David to purchase Morse hardware, and he was happy to pay me cash, and his family are still reaping the benefits from that.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
The land that
And
was homesteaded.
one of them told me recently that it's very profitable because of these subsidies, which will probably never be. You can't get rid of them after you get them in place.
So were you so was your father's name Weir?
No, my father's name was Fuller, Pfueller. The first husband died.
Ah, so you have two half-sisters.
I had two half-sisters. In fact, I had three, but they've all died.
Well, so your father was Fuller. Was he?
He emigrated from Germany when he was a little boy, I think 9 years old, and his mother was ill, and she knew there was no future for him. The land there was divided up until there was nothing, and she wanted him to come to the United States. There was a relative who would take him. They lived in the Midwest somewhere. So he was put on a ship with some money pinned inside of his underwear, which somebody stole.
Oh.
So he arrived at Ellis Island, I guess, destitute. And somehow he got into the town, and he didn't speak English and had no skills, but he walked down the street and he realized that people came out of the saloons and it was warm in there and he could see food on the counter. So he would dart in and grab something to eat and then dart out before anybody caught him. And one of the bartenders saw this little boy and was concerned. So one day he watched and he grabbed him. And he found the name of the relatives who would take him, and I guess got him on a train and sent him all by himself, not speaking English. And they were furniture makers. So he worked there for a while.
Where did they send him? Which town was he in?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I can't tell you that. And he had no education and never had an opportunity to. But he worked. He worked on the railroad coming across, and he worked at anything that he could do with his hands. And finally found his way to Waterville and married, and he had a little wheat farm, but he was never a farmer. So somebody else had to do that. But that's where he met my mother, who was a widow.
What a story.
Yeah.
Think of the fear and uncertainty and hardship. Good heavens.
Mm-hmm. Tough.
Well, it made tough people, didn't it?
Sure.
Strong people.
Mm-hmm.
Only the strong could survive.
Yeah, either that or.
Amazing.
But I had a niece on his side who was into genealogy, clear up to here, and she told me some things about him that before he left Germany, their parish church, whatever it was, he had to go to it, and I don't think he liked it. But one day he went in because he had to, and he had some marbles in his pocket, and one fell out, and the church was uneven, so it rolled down the aisle all the way. And the minister, whatever he was, grabbed my father by his clothes and took him to the door and put him out, and my father never entered a church again.
What a story.
That was the end.
Isn't it wonderful that stories like that come down through a family?
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
Gail went back to Germany and found the area. I think it was in Saxony somewhere.
Gail was your brother.
Yes, he went back and found it. And his grandson, who spoke German, went back with him, and it helped because Gail knew no German at all.
So your mother and father met in Waterville, and did they stay there a long while?
No, I don't know how long, but I think there wasn't enough to support, and I don't think he wasn't a farmer. So I think he started a Ford car dealership in Waterville, and then they went down to Wenatchee, where he went into a garage selling cars, not Fords, I don't think. But and then he came to Bellingham to start the automotive parts business, and he came here because the mills who ran those Ross carriers and other vehicles. Do you remember the Ross carriers?
With the big lumber carriers that used to go through downtown Bellingham.
All the time. I remember.
Carrying loads of lumber.
Right.
Sawn lumber.
Right. From the Flynn Mill probably into town somewhere.
I remember that.
And so he sold parts to them, and made his way and established what turned into automotive parts.
So what year do you suppose he came to Bellingham?
Well, I think I was in first or second grade. If I was born in 1950. But I think I entered Silver Beach in the school in the first grade.
So you would have been 6 or 7?
Yeah.
So that would have been 88 or 9 years ago.
And now Aaron's children go to Silver Beach School.
Ah. Yeah, that's fun. And Silver Beach School was built when Dr. Gray was the president of the school board.
Right. That certainly would have been. And penmanship was terribly important. And Mr. Rice had developed the Rice penmanship. And he used to come once a week, and he would go round and round and round and round. You were supposed to make your hand go. And I guess that's about all I remember of him. I remember my first and second grade teachers. The first teacher I loved, I think her name was Miss Losey. And the second grade teacher was Miss Kopang. And I was scared to death of her, and I still blame her for the reason I'm terrible in arithmetic. Because I pretended I understood. I couldn't ask her a question.
You were afraid to ask her a question. So your father started United, what was the name of the business? United?
Automotive parts.
Automotive Parts.
But we moved out to Lake Whatcom, and we lived in the Flynn house. Mr. Flynn was a relative who was head of the Flynn mill, which was at Silver Beach. I think it was called Flynn. And those were terrible times because when they had work, they had all these workers who depended on them. And when they didn't have any work, they were all poverty-stricken. And I remember a lot of really poor kids in that school. And I can remember things about how tough it was.
So you lived, the Flynn house was in the Silver Beach area?
It was in, it was between the Geneva area. You go across, and then you go up Dakin Street, and it's at the end of it. It was quite a nice home.
Is it still there?
It's still there, overgrown, and I don't know what it's like inside now.
But somebody's living in it.
Yes, I think so. I have driven up and have looked, and Pat drove up. She was interested, and it's kind of overgrown. There was property on this side that really had a little orchard on it, and I think it's all kind of run down. And the people around us were all mill workers and very poor, and they were pathetic.
I know that there still are lots of little houses around that area.
Yes, yes.
And they worked at Larson Mill, and there were always mills at the south end of the lake, weren't there? At the north, well, whatever end that is.
Whatever end it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the logs came drifting, were towed down the lake.
Yes, they were. Yeah. And there used to be a lot of piling that they were fastened to. In fact, you still see a lot of
Still see them.
piling.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the automotive supply. I haven't got that name right yet.
Yeah. Yes, that was it. Automotive parts, they called it.
Okay.
And
Wasn't it in the building that used to be the station?
yes, it was across the street, and then they moved across into that building that they occupied all the years afterwards, and until they went out of business, the chain stores were.
Like every.
But yes, we're getting all the business.
Yeah.
And my nephew, Gail's son, tried to sell it, and nobody would buy it.
But the
So
building
they sold
was
the building.
The building was just across the street from the power company and Greyhound bus station.
Yes.
And was not that building the depot for the interurban railroad at one time?
No, that would have been the interurban depot.
Or was it just beside it?
Beside it, I think. Yeah.
Because I know that the interurban station
Yes.
was there, or
Yeah.
the depot,
Yeah, it didn't
somewhere.
work very long. Yeah, it didn't go very far. You still see the piling here where.
Down along the
Yeah.
Juggernaut, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So you and Gail grew up in Bellingham. Were there any other brothers or sisters?
Not in our family. There were half sisters on both sides.
I remember Gail,
Yes.
nice
Yes.
man.
He died quite young. He had open heart surgery early on, and it was kind of a miserable death. I was awfully sorry about that.
Did he have children?
Yes, and Gretchen White still lives in Gail's house in Edgemore, and his grandson, Gretchen is how is she related to Gretchen and Gail? Well, anyway, they're related to Gail and Gretchen Fuller now. Gretchen also was German, and they lived out at Geneva for a long time. We used to see them. That's when Gail started to run, and Genevieve started to run, because she turned into quite a champion runner.
Oh, I didn't know that. So Gail was an athlete, huh?
Well, he was a runner, and his daughter, and Gail used to go back to meets to watch this grandson. He was so proud of him. And Mike was in high school, Bob's son, and Mike was running, and he said when his coach found out that he was related to Genevieve Fuller, he was all excited because he had another runner. Well, Mike still runs, and
I knew that.
yeah, and
So
he ran the marathon in Seattle. We went down and
were you a runner?
heck,
Well, you never know. It must.
nor was David.
It was in the genes.
We were short-legged
Yeah.
people, and there was no runner in our family.
So, well, so you went to Silver Beach School,
Yeah.
and then I bet you went to Whatcom High School?
Yes. Gail went to Fairhaven. He was really bright, and his teachers wanted him to have teachers at Fairhaven that they knew. So he would go across town in the streetcar to Fairhaven, and whereas I started in at Whatcom, and that's where I went to school first. It was a high school, wasn't it? It was a high school when I went there.
Yes. What year did you graduate?
From high school, I think in about 1929,
Okay.
because I graduated from college in 1935.
An interesting thing that Neely and I learned from writing the book about the Gray family is that after Fairhaven and Whatcom consolidated in 1904,
Yes, then she moved.
The city was concerned about bringing the two former cities together.
Right.
And so they stopped calling them Fairhaven and Whatcom High Schools for about 10 years. They called them North High School and South High School. And they had a common graduation. So when Margaret Gray graduated in 1911, she was the valedictorian of the combined Bellingham high schools.
She was.
She was the best student in the two high schools, and they had the ceremony at the Vex Theater on Cornwall Avenue.
Oh, for goodness sake.
A common
Yeah.
graduation.
Yes.
And then apparently that went on for about 10 years, and then for reasons that I don't understand, they began to call them Whatcom and Fairhaven high schools again.
Right.
And so,
Well, and the first year that we were married, I remember, I think it was New Year's Eve, somebody told us that Fairhaven was burning.
1935.
And so we went scooting over and drove to this side of the bridge, I think, and watched. Went up in flames.
Well, I remember David telling me watching when E.K. Wood's mill burned.
Yes.
Fires, there were terrible fires in those days.
Terrible fires, terrible fires.
And they were big entertainment apparently for young people.
Yeah. And you know, I remember those those burners. Do you remember those burners maybe that the mills all had? And they were all along the bay. And they had a net top
Kind of a
over
wire,
them, but still the soot.
and the sparks would fly.
And the soot blew everywhere. Everybody had to hang their clothes outside to dry. And it didn't matter where you lived. When you took your clothes in, you had to shake the soot out of them.
It must have been terrible on lungs.
It must, that, when they talk about pollution now,
Oh.
I think they don't know.
No. Well, between the smoke from the mills and the smoke from the fires in the woods,
Right,
and they burned the slash, and
Right.
the world was full of smoke.
yeah. That David's father, when he came here, described, he had started Morse Hardware, but he drove out, or went on horseback out, and he said the trees were so thick you could hardly move between them. And I think again, he could get some land for free by clearing it. And he would go out and drill a hole through the tree trunk, push a wick through it, a piece of cloth, soaked in kerosene, and start it burning. And then you would go back a week later and go through, and the trees would have fallen. And then it was a forest of stumps.
You know, I've never heard that.
Haven't you? Well, he described that in letters home to his mother.
Oh my.
Those are up in the
Well, I knew that
archives.
I knew that technique was used to burn up fallen timber because you were trying to farm on the land and you had to get rid of it. But I'd never heard of falling a tree that way. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Ha.
I remember reading a novel that somebody wrote that described that, and it described the smoke. It was just a pall of smoke. You could hardly walk through it.
Wow.
And that's how they were felling the trees. And then, of course, you'd have a forest of stumps.
Oh, sure.
And then David's father, of course, sold dynamite, which is what they used to blast the stumps.
Sure, he probably sold a lot of dynamite.
I think he did. And they had a powder building that they built someplace out in the county. And I remember David
A powder magazine, they called
They
it.
called it a powder magazine. And I remember David wanted to find that. And we drove out and drove along some country roads, and he went as near as Cecil could direct him, and probably found the area.
Well, now, you went to Whatcom, but I know David went to Fairhaven.
Right.
Did you meet in high school or after high school?
Yes, we met. Kate Spencer was a friend of mine at Whatcom, lived nearby, and she had a party at her house, which was in the Broadway Park area. And she invited me. I didn't have a date, not anybody had a date, but David was her date. And we met for the first time, and long time later, she reminded me of something that I don't think I even knew it at the time, that he walked me home. I lived nearby. He walked me home from her party. Of course, she was really in love with Stu Blythe from day one, so that was okay.
Oh, and she ended up marrying him.
Yeah.
That's,
And she and Stu had an interesting life, and a lot of sadness early on. Their first child had a cruel defect and died. They worked hard to get enough money to pay the surgeon because he had to be paid in cash. And she died before she got through the surgery. So they went through that heartbreak. Must have been just awful. But then, of course, they went on to have 3 healthy girls after that.
yes, good.
Yeah.
So, you and David married when?
1935.
Shortly after, was that shortly after high school?
Shortly after college.
Ah,
I graduated from college
you went to
in
college.
June at the university, and then we married the end of August. We married on Labor Day weekend. That was because David was earning $60 a month, which was enough to live on in those days. And Cecil raised his pay to $75 the day he got married. So we were lush, and we started out on our honeymoon in David's mother's car. We didn't have a car. And
Got as far as
we
Waterville.
drove up into Canada, and we had an itinerary planned, but we ran out of money. And so we went to Grandma's house and stayed the rest of the week.
Well, my, 1935. Well, so, and of course Cecil, who was David's half-brother,
Yes, and
quite a bit older,
a lot older, old enough to be his father.
a generation older, right?
Yes. And Cecil was younger. No, I mean Charlie was younger. The other children in the family died. One boy was stillborn, and the little girl died. And in Dr. Gray's descriptions, I think she died, I think it was the same thing that was killing the babies, that he was so sorry to have for our patients because he couldn't do anything for them.
Well, my goodness, what a terrifying, you could die if you just nicked your finger and cut your finger.
Right.
It
Right.
was,
There was no...
life was pretty tenuous in those days.
Yes, it was, and people died.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ah. Well, so you've had quite a family. You and David had how many children?
We had 4 children.
Bob is the oldest.
No, Pat is the oldest.
Oh, Pat is the oldest.
Uh-huh. Pat's the oldest, and 3 years later was Bob, and then a year and a half later was DC,
Ah,
and then 5 years later was Katie.
I think I just met Katie this year.
Yes, she's coming with her son. She lives in Maine. She loves Maine. She and her husband have loved living there. They have a good life in Maine.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's where the Morses started, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Good.
And Katie has been in touch with some of the relatives from David's father's family who stayed there. And there's still one cousin in Waterville, distant cousin. And Katie has been in touch with them. They've met because Katie went to a town meeting. They had town meetings in Maine. And everybody gets to know everybody. And in this town meeting, a man heard her name was Morse. So he spoke to her and said they had Morse relatives. And so Katie met these people, and his father's, I guess she would have been his cousin, was an elderly woman who still lived in Waterville, and she had saved everything. And she's the one, I think, who had sent the letters. They had saved every letter. They sent all the letters across to David. And those were treasures.
So now you said Waterville, but
By Waterville, Maine.
oh, really?
Yes.
Isn't that a coincidence? Waterville, Maine, and your family came
Yes.
from Waterville,
Right.
Washington.
Right.
Isn't that interesting? Oh, so who has those letters now?
They're up in the archives. They're prize letters.
Wonderful. They're in the archive here.
Well, of course, they all came to David. So when
Sounds like maybe there's a book there.
they went, there is a book there. There really is. It would be a good book. His letters home to his mother described everything here. Good descriptions. And the relative had saved every letter. They were in the same envelopes. And she sent the whole works to David. And first we went down to the museum. I think it was Jeff Jewell that we talked to. And Pat got interested in the archives up at the college, and the letters all ended up there. They have the whole works.
How many years do you suppose those letters span? I mean, a long.
I don't know.
So they are letters from.
I would just be guessing.
They're the letters from.
From David's father back to his mother in Maine, and then later, after his mother died, he still wrote to his older brother.
Oh my! So.
And he died, and then there was a cousin, Marston Morse, who taught at Princeton, and his family are still at Princeton, and we have gone to see them. They're very, very interesting family. Of course, he's long gone. His second wife and her children are some of her children are living there. She writes me elaborate letters at Christmas time telling me about all of these relatives, and they're all doing something interesting. And
Huh. Well, I
And
guess
she's
maybe one
not-
day I'm gonna have to take a look at those letters.
yeah, you will have to, because I think you'll be just fascinated with them. The most pathetic letters were writing home about the death of his children.
Oh,
Yeah, just heartbreaking. And then his wife, Etta, his first wife, wrote home describing the baby daughter's, the only girl, her death, which was exactly described by Dr. Gray in his letter.
do you think,
My mother said it was called summer complaint. She thought it was due to poor refrigeration, that food, grew a poison.
sure,
Mhm.
sure. Huh. Oh my,
So that's the way it was. Aren't we lucky?
we surely are. And yet, even in those days, a few tough people lived to be your age.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yeah.
My grandfather was born in 1852 or 3 and lived to be 100. So
Well,
they must have had a natural resistance to
yeah.
disease and
David
infection.
lived, of course, quite a long life too.
Oh, absolutely.
His 2 older brothers had both died. But there are still cousins that Pat is in touch with him more than I am.
Well, Joyce, you and your families, the Pfuellers and the Morses have been a significant force in this community. It must be a feeling of satisfaction for you to.
It is, and I think Bellingham is the best place in the world, and I think Fairhaven is the best part of Bellingham.
Aren't we
I think
fortunate?
moving over here was just a stroke of luck.
So you're living in 12th Street Village
And
in a great large condominium on the 3rd floor where you look down into Padden Creek.
yes, it's a great location.
Yeah.
It's quite quiet here, and the people in this building, Brian, they are so good to me. I just can't believe it.
Well, that's,
And I have Neely over here, who is a honey.
maybe it's because you deserve it.
Well,
Huh.
I don't know.
Huh. Well, now before you've lived in a number of places in Bellingham. In your marriage,
Yeah.
I remember when you lived at the lake,
Yes.
but I'm sure you lived somewhere before that.
Well, when we were first married, we rented a house on Forest Street, way down on Forest Street. I don't suppose it's still there. It's
North of the
fallen down
hospital?
by now.
North of the hospital? Or where the hospital used to be?
Not far from where the hospital used to be. Uh-huh.
And then where did you live after that?
Well, then, David's mother went to California to live near her second son, William. His first wife had been ill and died, and she went down. She thought she could be helpful to him. I think that's. Although at first she moved down and lived with a friend, Mrs. Weiser, for some reason. And lived with William for a little while, and then he moved to Pasadena and built a house. And she went down, I think Glendale was the place, and lived in a PEO home. She was a PEO. And she had her own little space there and was very happy there, ate in their dining room.
So did you move into her home here?
And she lived in that place until she died. She died down there.
So then did you move into the Morse house?
Well, we lived in that because it was empty. And
That's
it wasn't,
the big Victorian on
yeah,
Garden Street.
Wasn't good for a house to be left empty. And she had, the first house that was built there was a pattern house. And that's what the first Mrs. Morse, Etta Morse, had chosen this house. I think you could have the inside the way you wanted it, but the outside was you bought from a catalog. And then when after she died, first Etta was the one that built that house. She was the first wife. And he built it for her. She chose this pattern. And it was quite a pretentious house with a curving stairway.
That's the house that's still there.
Still there. It looks terrible now.
Yes.
Just,
it's a college dormitory now.
Sad.
It's a barber house.
Sad house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Barber was the...
The
So did you live in that house, you and David?
we lived there just because it was empty for a while. And then we bought the house on South Garden Street, which my father really bought for us. We were broke. And when David was buying Morse Hardware stock and didn't have any money, we sold that house and put the money into the purchase of Morse Hardware. And we rented the house on the corner, which had been the Montague house. And we lived there for a while renting it, and then we bought it from the Talbot, the youngest Talbot, Hilton Talbot, had bought it. And we rented it from him for about 6 months, and then we bought it from him. And then we had considerable work to do on it because it was not a house for one woman. And we lived there till our children were in high school. And I wanted to move out of that house. David would like to have stayed there, I think. But because he could walk down to the store and he liked it. But I wanted out of that house because we were close to town and it's full of kids all the time, and some of it wasn't desirable. And I was tired of that situation, so we moved to the lake and rented the Quackenbush house, which was empty because Mr. Quackenbush died and Mrs. Quackenbush was taken to Seattle to live with a daughter-in-law. She got to be 100 years old. And the house wasn't for sale, but finally they decided they would sell it to us. So we lived there, and the house, then we bought the lot across the street. We didn't have any money, but my sister loaned us the money to buy this lot. And then we were able to build our own house, the only time we ever built a house, which we loved. And then we sold it and moved into the condominium in town. It got to be too much for David taking care of the dock that we had down in front.
Sure.
And
Across the road.
the last storm we had out there, DC and Jan had to come over and help us with that dock, which was going to blow away in the wind. And that did it. That was the end. And we saw this place being built on Forest Lane, and we liked the location and liked the layout that we were shown.
That was a nice...
It was supposed to be finished in 3 months, and we moved into the Leopold Hotel because we sold our house, and put everything in storage, and lived in the Leopold Hotel in 2 rooms. And it was going to be for like 3 weeks, and we were there, I think, more than 3 months.
I bet that got old.
And then we finally could move into the place on Forest Lane, which was a very nice place. And
It really was.
We liked that until after David died. I didn't want to live there anymore.
Well, this is surely a nice place now, Joyce.
It turned out to be the perfect spot.
Great. Do you know we've talked for an hour?